Thanks, Naomi. Good luck.
Well, unfortunately, the time is up. We have to go, but thank you for watching this special edition of Sidewalks Entertainment. Like I said earlier, it was such an honor to interview Naomi Judd twice on our TV show. You know, why don't we all listen to the Judd's music or find videos on YouTube and remember this incredible human being. Rest in peace, Naomi, and thank you for the decades of entertainment.
Because my parents told me I have to be responsible.
Because my first coach told me, you can do this.
Because my teacher helped me see the choices.
Because my coach treated me like everybody else.
Because my boss showed me how to do a good job.
Because a mentor believed in my potential.
Is why I am where I am today.
I'm swimming faster than I ever dreamed I could.
I discovered that I could work as an artist.
I led my high school team to 2 championships.
I am a valuable employee.
I have a career that I am passionate about.
I will be whatever I want to be.
What can you do?
What can you do?
Like all young people, youth with disabilities should grow up expecting to work and succeed. For more information, visit whatcanyoudocampaign.org.
Él es Pedro, mi papá, un hombre de los meros meros. No conoce la palabra miedo. Nada lo detiene. Y además de todo es muy fuerte, pero ahora es más fuerte porque ya se vacunó.
La vacuna contra el COVID-19 es completamente gratis y puedes obtenerla en cualquier sede de Denver Health. Para mayor información visita denverhealth.org/vacúnate o llama al 720-728-1294.
Welcome to the Safety, Housing, Education, and Homelessness Committee of Denver City Council. The Safety, Housing, Education, and Homelessness Committee begins now.
Good morning, everyone. It is Wednesday, May 25th. This is the Denver City Council Safety Committee. My name is Paul Cashman. I represent South Denver District 6 and serve as chair of this committee. Before we get into our work for the day, let me ask my colleagues first to introduce themselves. We'll start to my left.
Good morning, Robin Kniech, at large.
Good morning, everyone. Kevin Flynn, Southwest Denver District 2.
Jamie Torres, District 3.
Good morning, Amanda Sawyer, District 5.
Well, thank you. Welcome, everyone. Emily, do we have anyone virtual this morning?
We have Councilmember Black watching online, but not participating.
Very fine. Thank you. Pardon me? Oh, excuse me.
Stacy Gilmore, District 11.
I think I've heard of you, ma'am. Thank you. That would be our council president. Thank you. I apologize. My mind is elsewhere today. It would be impossible to miss, I don't know if irony is the best word, but not only is today the second anniversary of the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, but yesterday, barely 18 hours after this council passed 2 proclamations, one declaring May as Mental Health Month, the other declaring June as Gun Violence Awareness Month. Less than 18 hours after passing those 2 proclamations, deranged gunmen marched into a school in Uvalde, Texas, and took the lives of at least 19 young children and 2 educators. And I wish I had words of wisdom to offer. I only have words of heartbreak and distress, and would just like to take a moment of silence just to mourn the lives of those lost, Mr. Floyd, and those lost yesterday, and just to consider where we find ourselves today. Thank you all. I would just ask if any of my colleagues have additional comments. If not, we'll get into the day's work. We do have one action item that Council President Gilmore will be presenting on, a bill regarding homeowners' rights in cases of foreclosure, following which we will hear regarding a briefing on pretrial services. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Council President Gilmore, and after the presentation, we will have, we've got 3 people signed up for public comment.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and appreciate you acknowledging the world events, the United States events that we're reeling from today, and appreciate that. Good morning to my colleagues. I'm happy to be here with you today to talk about a bill that my council office and I have been working on since March of this year. Home ownership is the primary contributor to building wealth and creating economic stability in our community. There has been a long history of barriers and discriminatory practices that have prevented more people of color from obtaining home ownership. For those families that achieve home ownership, the increasing cost of living in our city continues to threaten that stability. I understand the strain and the stress that puts on our families, older adults, and those with fixed incomes. Within different parts of our city, numerous homeowners associations, I'll be referring to them as HOAs throughout my presentation, are connected to communities. They are designed to manage common and shared property interests, along with enforcing covenants for residents to follow. The city does not regulate HOAs, and often when issues arise, they are referred to the state. It was not until recently that we were made aware of one particular HOA in Green Valley Ranch that had in progress a disproportionately large number of foreclosures without the homeowners knowing what their rights and resources were to mitigate that foreclosure. On February 8th, a constituent in Green Valley Ranch contacted my council office, stating that his family lost their property to foreclosure from the Master Homeowners Association of Green Valley Ranch and was looking for resources. His situation, like many, involved not receiving notices of his citations before a foreclosure was initiated. Immediately, I reached out to the Department of Housing Stability, HOST, where we later found 50 additional properties being foreclosed on this year. This elevated our concern when it was determined that there were less than 5 foreclosures for HOAs in other parts of our city. This was a pivotal moment that began our uncovering of multiple foreclosures occurring in one neighborhood. 3 of the properties were also identified as being part of the city's affordable housing portfolio. It was through the collaboration of HOST, our Department of Housing Stability, the Office of Financial Empowerment and Protections, and Denver Metro Fair Housing, along with many other nonprofit partners, that we quickly began to investigate and initiate individual contact with the homeowners. Our first priority was to make contact, identify the need, and connect them to resources. I have heard so many heartbreaking stories from our residents. The majority of the foreclosures that were initiated were for small violations, such as weeds in the rocks, blinds in their front windows, trash cans left at the curb and not moved behind the fence, basketball hoops left at the curb. These initial citations, when not addressed, or many times when addressed, but not properly documented by the HOA, they resulted in thousands of dollars of fines levied against the homeowner. Tragically, because of the lack of communication, many homeowners did not know that their homes were in the foreclosure process, sometimes having new owners come and knock on their door saying that that previous homeowner or the current homeowner had to vacate. The main question that kept coming up was, how can we, as the City and County of Denver, ensure that property owners, when faced with foreclosure, know what their rights and resources are? As I said, on February 8th, we started this journey. I was contacted by Mr. Gil Gonzalez from Green Valley Ranch asking for help. His family's home had been foreclosed on, and he was seeking resources to save his family's home of 17 years. My staff and I attended multiple meetings, including weekly with city agencies, our Office of Housing, the Office of Financial Empowerment and Protections, our Denver Economic Development Office, the Sheriff's Department, Denver Metro Fair Housing, and the Department of Local Affairs. And I want to acknowledge all of the city agencies and our state partners because they have been so wonderful through this process in bringing together resources. We created an action plan and identified how we would assist homeowners moving forward. In early March, I was contacted by Representative Ricks and asked for my feedback on an HOA bill she was working at the state. My staff and I provided her and Senators Coleman and Gonzalez with feedback. I also began exploring a city-led ordinance to provide a provision to further clarify and protect homeowners. On March 12th of this year, we held the Housing Resource Town Hall in Green Valley Ranch with host, the Office of Financial Empowerment and Protections, other city agencies, and many other nonprofit partners to listen to homeowner concerns and get them connected to the appropriate agency resources. On March 16th, a Monday, I asked Governor Jared Polis and Attorney General Phil Weiser to launch an investigation and a foreclosure moratorium. That same day, I was contacted by a Deputy Attorney General and investigator from the AG's office. Every resident that emails me or my office, we turn around and we send that contact information and get that resident connected with the Attorney General's office. House Bill 22-1137 passed on third reading in the Senate on Monday, May 2nd, with plenty of good protections. We modeled this draft bill after the requirement in the residential rental licensure program to provide tenants with their rights and resources, doing the same by requiring HOAs to provide written notice of owners' rights and a listing of legal and housing resources at least 30 days prior to initiating any foreclosure action. Today in safety, I would be honored to have your support, and it would be adopted on June 30th by Council to give the city agencies time to create the written notice by August 30th of 2022, which is the effective date of this bill. Because the state bill has an effective date of August 9th, we wanted to make our effective date, of course, after the state bill, so we're not preempted in this action. On Saturday, March 12th, we held a Housing Resource Town Hall in partnership with HOST, the Office of Financial Empowerment and Protection, and various organizations. Denver Metro Fair Housing, Colorado Legal Services, Colorado Housing Assistance Corporation, Brothers Redevelopment, Del Norte Neighborhood Development, Denver Housing Authority, Newstead Community Development, Northeast Denver Housing Center, Denver Urban Renewal Authority, and the Community College of Denver's Office on Aging were all in attendance to connect affected homeowners with housing resources as soon as possible. It was critical for me and city agencies to listen to the experiences of my constituents and what they had to deal with this particular HOA. Many stated a lack of communication, accountability, and transparency from this HOA, with issues involving never receiving mailed notices, delayed inspections from the HOA, accounts that failed to be closed after issues had been rectified, and their interest rates being high. Since February, our District 11 office has fielded close to 300 calls and emails and personal visits by our residents. Prior to the passage of House Bill 1137, the city didn't have an avenue to provide oversight in how HOAs manage their operations. Because of this, we are seeing homeowners lose their homes to menial things that could easily be fixed with proper communication and follow-up, such as ripped screens, driveway oil stains, and trash cans left out too long. This is the press release that I sent to the Governor and Attorney General on March 16th. My office, HOST, and the Office of Financial Empowerment and Protection have continued to connect homeowners to resources, and they have been amazing partners. This is the housing resource list, or a portion of the housing resource list that HOST has been providing homeowners. And we have other nonprofit partners that I had mentioned before, and this document will become the foundation of the written required notice to owners of their rights and resources. Through this process, HOST has also developed a database to track homeowners, who the homeowners are working with, if they have filed an intent to cure, and or if they've received financial or legal support. The passage of House Bill 1137, the Homeowners Association Board Accountability and Transparency Bill in March contained direct resident feedback, as well as my council office's own amendments. The House bill created an immense foundation. The Denver Notice Bill adds to that framework. We are closely watching the House bill and wanted to add additional measures to prevent families from falling through the cracks and losing their home. But first, here's what the House bill does. With the passage, it will for the first time make sure that an HOA is required by law to provide monthly itemized accounting. It will provide a notice of delinquency for unit owners who are behind on their assessments. It will provide the option for a homeowner to enter into a payment plan. It will prohibit an HOA from imposing late fees, fines, and interest, and caps those at $500 total. It prohibits an HOA from charging a rate of interest greater than 8% per year, and it requires an HOA to adopt a policy to provide the unit owner with contact information for one or more foreclosure counseling services in the county. This last clause is the provision our bill further clarifies through ordinance. The proposed city bill does two things. It reorganizes existing provision and adds a new provision for HOA notification. In subsection C, the new language, HOA shall provide written notice of owner's rights and resources on a form provided or approved by the city at least 30 days prior to initiating such action. Such notice shall contain a listing of legal and housing resources for homeowners facing foreclosure, and the association or the HOA shall maintain a record of such notice, including the date and time the notice was provided. The 30 days is a stopgap measure. Because the state bill is already so robust and will have already been implemented, the 30 days is set up to catch any homeowner who, for any reason, falls through the cracks. I have to thank our local media. Since February of this year, the media has kept these issues at the forefront, highlighting the experience of our constituents and covering their stories. Media outlets such as the Denver Post, Denver Right, 9 News, Denver 7, CBS 4, the Denver Channel, Colorado News Patrol, and KDVR have been asking the right questions and making sure that we elevate this issue and we can take action on it. Our next steps, we're in safety today. Mayor Council will be next week, and that would be on consent. We're looking at first reading on June 6th, and then we don't have a quorum for council on June 13th, and so second reading would be on June 20th. And I didn't do this work alone. I want to sincerely thank Melissa Sotelo and Chiquita Sanders in my council office. They're joining me in chambers today. This is, I have to say, every elected official's nightmare scenario. When you have close to 50 property owners in one neighborhood at risk of losing their individual single-family home, and my staff and team pulled together, worked long hours, and heard all of those heartbreaking stories as well from our homeowners. I need to thank Anshul Baga. He's our city attorney, and he has been amazing working through the bill with us. And so thank you very much, Anshul, for all of your attention to this and quick turnaround. Really appreciate that. I want to also thank Britta Fisher, Maureen Breyer Morley, and Jack Wiley with our host office, Jay Salas, Ron Ojeda, and Alvin Tafoya with our Office of Financial Empowerment and Protections Office. And then a special thank you to William Neidig with Denver Metro Fair Housing. William has been an amazing partner, and really I've learned so much from him through this process. And at that March 12th town hall that we had, we didn't have enough seats for everybody. It was standing room only. And I have to say, when I was hearing all of our constituents' heartbreaking stories, William, for a lot of that time, was standing right next to me, ready to take a homeowner and say, can we go set you up with a housing counselor so you can actually talk to somebody in confidence and we can figure out how we can save your home and get you resources. And so I really want to thank William for that work as well. And I'm ready to take questions.
Thank you very much for the presentation, President Gilmore. We do have 3 people signed up for public comment. Each speaker will get 2 minutes. We'll start off virtually with Vicki Wilhite. Do we have Vicki in the queue? Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Go right ahead.
I am Vicki Wilhite, a Together Colorado board member and a co-leader of the Social Justice Ministry at Shorter Community AME Church. Thank you for allowing me to provide a public comment. I have lived in Green Valley Ranch for 24 years, and I was appalled when I found out how much power homeowner associations have. I, like many others, understood the functions of a homeowners association to oversee repairs, maintain common areas, covenants, things like that. I thought that they were put in place to protect the community and not to harm it. So I ask, how is it that a homeowners association has the power to decide who can be unhoused? See, it's not just properties, it's our homes. It's the place where we lay our heads, hug our loved ones, and make our memories. Many of us have struggled to even own a home. While HB 221137 caps fees and improves notifications to homeowners when faced with a foreclosure, there is nothing in the bill that stops a foreclosure. It seems predatory for an HOA to have possessory liens over someone's home. Who is protecting homeowners? It isn't protection when a majority of the board of directors can vote to refer someone to a collection agency or an attorney even without having a public hearing. It isn't protection when someone can be foreclosed on for missing 3 monthly installment payments within 15 days after they were due for small violations. We were hoping for guardrails and oversights of HOAs so they cannot take a person's home. So the bill is a toothless bill, and we want humane solutions that keep we must do better. Thank you.
That is the time we have for our first speaker. Next up in person, do we have Jerry Danso in the room? I'm not seeing Jerry, and we don't have Jerry online, I know that. Then we'll move on to our final speaker. That would be Jesse Paris, also virtual.
Yes, good morning, members of council. May I be heard? Yes, my name is Jesse LaShawn Paris, and I'm representing for Black Star Action Movement for Self-Defense, Positive Action Commitment for Social Change, as well as the Unity Party of Colorado, the East Denver Residents Council, Frontline Black News, and I'll be the next mayor of Denver in 2023. And I reside in District 8 in Christopher Herndon's district. Initially, I was in favor of this bill this morning, but after hearing Vicky's testimony, I'm not too sure if I am in full support of it anymore. As she alluded to, it doesn't have any teeth to it. Seems like the HOAs are able to do whatever they want to do, run amok. I'm glad to see that council's trying to do something about that, but this bill, unfortunately, doesn't make the mark. So I applaud your efforts, Stacey Gilmore, and the people that attended the community meeting in March, but I don't think that this is going to alleviate the crisis that we have right now. We have a housing crisis. If HOAs are still evicting people and putting people out, that is not helping our housing crisis, that is making it worse. If HOAs are still able to take people's homes, that is making our crisis even worse. So I applaud your efforts, but it's just not enough. Thank you.
That concludes our public speakers. Questions or comments from members of council? Councilmember Kinich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a question for either Councilwoman Gilmore or if you want to have Anshul answer it. But there were some deep concerns shared in the testimony about the state bill, and I know how quickly the state legislation passed, and some of the details are really hard sometimes to grasp, given how fast things happened. But I wanted to just ask two particular questions. Under that new state bill, the concern was they can still foreclose for fines and fees. Your slides seem to be a little different than that. So I wanted to see if you wanted to clarify that, in fact, what the state bill said about foreclosing for fines.
I'd be happy to. I wish that we could just legislate away that homeowners associations have the right to hold a lien on individual properties within a certain area, but unfortunately we don't. And that was not part of the state bill either, because those liens are most likely tied to an individual homeowner's mortgage paperwork. And so there's really no way to legislate away having that lien on an individual homeowner's property. It's very complex, and there would have to be further action taken at the state to create that pathway to remove any threat of foreclosure, that would have to be taken up at the state level. And I'll go ahead and defer to Anshul if that would even be an opportunity, because again, those liens are tied to folks' mortgage paperwork, most likely.
So, thanks, Councilwoman Kanich. Anshul Bagga, Assistant City Attorney. So, the state bill does prohibit the HOA from pursuing foreclosure for outstanding fines owed. It does not prohibit an HOA for pursuing foreclosure for outstanding assessments owed.
Can you clarify what an assessment is? So we had many cases of people being penalized for the basketball hoop, the trash cans in the street, the blinds not being proper, that Councilwoman Gilmore. This bill stops any foreclosure based on those types of fines. Is that correct?
That's correct, going forward.
Going forward, okay. And then an assessment is what? Can you just describe what an assessment is in plain language for our community?
Sure. So my understanding of the assessments described in the bill are basically annual dues, basically. So dues paid to the HOA.
So in the future, there is a significant limit. You could no longer foreclose based on any of these penalties or not doing something right. The only thing is if you don't pay the dues to the association. So that is a significant piece. And I'm not trying to, suggest that it's enough, but it is something it's important for the community to understand that this is a significant change. One more thing, if you could just clarify, would the city have the power to do this? Would the city have the power to step in and change the things that HOAs can do in this regard legally? Do we have that authority?
The city has a limited ability to be able to legislate regarding HOA's ability to foreclose on property because part of that involves a judicial action. We would have limited ability to do that.
Got it. So I just wanted to help because this is a lot. It's a lot for a community to take in. And then the bill before us today, Councilwoman, is a bill. So let's just say, what happens today if someone gets this threat of foreclosure today? I understand the state bill will make a little change, but today, do homeowners get any information about their rights or resources?
No. There is no requirement. You would hope that homeowners would get that certified mail or email correspondence, etc. But there's nothing today that mandates that, and that's exactly how we got into the situation in the first place. And so the state bill really creates an amazing foundation, and what we're taking advantage of now is that narrow window of opportunity for us to further legislate at the city level to create that last stopgap protection for homeowners.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much because, I think throughout this, there is a lot of limitations to the city's legal powers, but you and the agencies you activated really stepped into the gap to lead. And I think this is a really creative way with very little legal power as a city to create a real piece of information for people to know their rights. And that is where any fight to stop any foreclosure going forward will begin, is knowing what your choices are and knowing who can help you. And so I am really excited to support this today. I'm interested in seeing if there's a little something else we can do, and stay tuned to see if there's another piece we can add to some future policy. But I think that this is an example of leading beyond just this legislation, but the convening, the information, and the advocacy that you have provided have really meant a lot, I think, to our city. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, Councilmember Sawyer.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And Council President Gilmore, I echo Councilwoman Kanich's sentiments. This is a really, really meaningful piece of legislation for residents in our community. So thank you so much for leading on this. Did want to ask a question about, sorry, I'm getting a little squeaky there, about assessments. So it was something that Anshul actually just said, because we are having a challenge with this in District 5 as well. So in a homeowners association, there are like your monthly dues that you are assessed over time, and usually they come out on a monthly or quarterly basis. There are also assessments that occur, special assessments. So for example, in District 5, we have a condo building that is an HOA, and Host has been very helpful in helping to support our residents in this, but their roof was damaged beyond repair, needs to be replaced. The capital account that they have does not have enough money, and that means that all of the homeowners in the HOA are being assessed a cost to be able to cover replacing the roof. We have a number of residents, like not as many as you, but in more than 25, who do not have the funds to be able to cover the assessment, special assessment for that roof. So I just want to make sure when we're talking about the word assessment in the language that we're very clear about what that means. So is it a special assessment for, for example, the roof, like the one I'm talking about? Is it non-payment of that? Is it non-payment of monthly dues? Is it both? I just want to make sure that we're very, very clear on that, so that when we get calls from residents, we know what to say.
Wonderful question, and I'll probably tag team with Anshul here. I have to say, homeowners associations and how they are set up at the state level, it's very, very deep and wide as far as what they can do and the powers that they have. And what you're talking about around, especially, really there's special assessments, or there's assessments, there's fines, and then there's fees. And so the special assessment that you're talking about is something that is a right of an HOA to do. And so many times if somebody lives in an area that is managed by a homeowners association, there is a required annual meeting for the board of directors, and that all of the residents are invited to. And usually at that time, the board will present the annual budget for the homeowners association, what it's going to cost to maintain common areas, shared property areas, etc. And that's something that we've even struggled in the past with, getting the homeowners association to even post that proposed annual budget in a timely fashion, so residents can plan their schedules out, go attend, ask questions, etc. And so what you're talking about is one of those special assessments that they, by law, can levy. And I would encourage the property owners and the residents that reside in that HOA area to make sure that they're attending those board meetings, to make sure that they're calling and they're very vocal around that. But then also, if somebody has a violation of, say, for example, you haven't put your trash can up behind the fence, you would most likely be given a notice to correct that issue. If you didn't correct it within the designated time, you would then be assessed a fine, and then those fines can also grow and tack on legal and other administrative fees to that fine as well. And so that's kind of a high-level explanation of it. Anshul, if I missed anything about assessments or you'd like to clarify, please.
Thanks, Councilwoman Gilmore. I think you pretty much covered it. Councilman Sawyer, the bill that Councilwoman Gilmore is presenting today involves notice prior to foreclosure. It doesn't make any reference necessarily to whether the foreclosure is for a special assessment versus a regular assessment. Under the state bill, an HOA can pursue foreclosure on a lien that is placed due to unpaid special assessments as well. So Councilman Gilmore's bill would apply to notices, would require notice prior to any foreclosure, whether it was special or regular assessments.
Okay, I really appreciate that. So let me just make sure that I've got my mind wrapped around this, because it's very difficult when we get into that like state versus city thing. If we hear from residents concerns about some of this, and the right of an HOA to assess a lien and foreclose on a property is within that HOA is a property right that is granted at the state level. But the notice requirement for a property that is being foreclosed upon for whatever reason, whether it be non-payment of dues, non-payment of fines, non-payment of special assessments, et cetera, any of that is now required to be noticed properly in the city and county of Denver once we get to June 20th, assuming that this passes.
Yes, because that will be part of the state bill once it gets signed. There are so many protections that are layered into the state bill that really there was not a lot that we could as a city expand upon that other than this last stopgap measure. And this will get us that door open with opportunity. And then I think we do need to explore it a little bit further and see what additionally we can require of HOA so that there's good, transparent communication. But, you know, for example, there's many different reasons that a lien might be utilized within an HOA. You know, definitely the buzzword around keeping curb appeal is one of those pieces, but I know that we researched and found a different issue in another county, that there was actually liens on homes because the original developer of that neighborhood had taken a loss on some properties that they had built. And so they wrote into the clause of joining into this neighborhood that if you sell your property, you're required to turn around and it was a percentage of your sale amount. You needed to pay it into this fund for the HOA. So there's many different layers of it, and we're just trying to make sure that homeowners have a chance to reach out. And I would definitely, we can get you over the list of resources, or they're in the PowerPoint. And I would definitely recommend looking at the appendix, because something that I've got to give big props to Jay Salas, Ron Ojeda, and Alvin Tafoya. They created a 6-page FAQ resource document for homeowners that we handed out at the March 12th community meeting. And when they originally had sent it, I was like, really? 6 pages? We can't have it front or back? But that's how complex this issue is. And right here, I'm showing you the timelines around what happens and all of the different go or no-go places. And honestly, if you're a homeowner that's working a couple of jobs, or you're an elder who's on a fixed income, it's very, very hard to navigate. And we within the city right now have amazing nonprofit partners that are ready to educate homeowners about it, provide resources, and we've even looked at bringing Steve Charbonneau in as mediating some of these conversations between homeowners and HOAs, because sometimes what can happen is a homeowner corrects something and then they never hear back. Or they, you know, ping the HOA again and say, hey, could you send somebody out? I've already fixed this. And there's no response. And then all that while, we found that people were still being assessed the fines and fees. And sometimes they were upwards of $25,000, $27,000 that homeowners had assessed in fines and fees. And honestly, with a little bit of education, homeowners can call their mortgage company, let them know what has transpired, or sign up with a housing counselor within the city, and that housing counselor will help you navigate the system. But many times a mortgage company will provide a secondary loan to that homeowner to pay those off, because it's not advantageous for a mortgage company to have a property go into foreclosure, because they're auctioned off. And you know, our median value of a home in Denver is upwards of $500,000. We've seen homes sold at auction for $200,000. So the amount of equity the homeowner loses is staggering.
So then thank you for that. I guess what might be helpful for, I don't know if it's, OFE or if it's host or if it's the city attorney's office. I'm not sure who to ask for this, but it might be really helpful to just get some very broad, basic language to be able to put in our newsletters, to be able to email to our homeowners associations, right? Like we have the Lowry Community Master Association. It covers 300 different homeowners associations within the neighborhood of Lowry. It would be nice to be able to alert them that this is happening, that there are going to be some changes, especially around the notification requirements, that they should be aware of that. And I'm not sure if they are or they aren't because it's a state thing. But the notification piece that we're taking on here, it would be helpful to just have some broad language that sort of says, heads up, HOA requirements are changing when it comes to notifications and foreclosures. So I'm not sure who to ask for that, but if we could get that, that would be hugely fantastic. Yes. Thank you to whoever, whichever agency or that will be. And then the last point or question, so Councilwoman Sita Baca and I had moved to formalize the eviction right to counsel ordinance, which was adopted by City Council last year. Anyone who makes up to 80% AMI in the City and County of Denver can access free legal counsel to help walk them through eviction, if they are being evicted. And we have contractors in place who are doing that work. I guess this might be a question for Anshul. Does that include, based on the language we wrote, owners, or is it only renters? And if it is owners, I would love to have a conversation potentially about shifting that language to include owners. Maybe take a look at that again and just make some small edits that would be able to provide some support for some of our residents who are experiencing this. So.
And before Anshul replies, just a time check. We've got 45 minutes left, and do have a briefing from the Department of Community Corrections. Anshul?
Thanks, Councilwoman Sawyer. I'll need to take a look at that provision in Chapter 27 to confirm whether it would include owners, and if it doesn't, I'm happy to work with you on making sure that those are included. Okay,
I am pretty sure it's only for renters, but this might be, Britta's shaking her head yes at me, thank you. So this might be something that we should have a conversation about then, not right this second. Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Council President Gilmore.
Yep, and we'll get you something for the entire council for your newsletters. I'm sure with the expertise we have here with city agencies and along with my council office, we can get a quick explanation for folks and make sure we're providing them with links and other resources. Thank you, Councilwoman.
All right, seeing Council Pro Tem Torres.
Just a quick comment and thanks for moving so quickly on this. We know in West Denver how disruptive just massive foreclosures can be to an entire community. So just kudos to you for digging in, and look forward to supporting it on the floor.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you very much for the presentation. Thanks to my colleagues for the questions and comments. Would someone like to move 617 to the full council? Moved by Sandoval, second by Flynn. Any objections to moving this forward? Seeing none. And I did neglect to welcome Councilmember Sandoval to the dais, and we have Councilmember Sedabaka with us virtually. Next on our agenda is welcome Greg Morrow, Director of our Division of Community Corrections, for a briefing on the division's pretrial services program.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Mr. Morrow, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, members of the committee. I'm Greg Morrow. I'm the Director of Community Corrections, and Emily is going to help me out here. I'm pleased today to talk about another program within Community Corrections, and that's our pretrial services agency, and also how it assists the court with bond setting practices.
And Greg, if I might interrupt for just a second, before you get started, I should have done this at the beginning. I want to tip my hat to our technical services people, because you will notice there is not a microphone sticking up in front of you, and we've had some improvements to our system, and it's much better delivery, and just hats off to technical services. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. So the hope of today's presentation is to provide some clarity in content and information really around 4 different areas. One, an overview of both pretrial as it sits in the criminal justice system, as well as the program itself. I want to talk a little bit about how pretrial release is very different than other community forms of supervision like parole and probation. I'll talk a little bit about the history and current practice of how bonds are set in Denver, especially some of the bail reform that's happened in the city over the past 10 to 12 years. And I'm going to share some data outcomes that we have on our supervised population. So when we talk about pretrial, the first step is, what does that mean? And we're talking about that phase of the criminal justice system that begins at arrest or citation and then ends with disposition. Disposition, it's important to know, doesn't always result in a conviction or a sentence. There are a number of cases where charges aren't filed. There are cases where they're dismissed or not guilty at trial. Decisions made at the pretrial stage are very different, both constitutionally and statutorily, than other parts of our criminal justice system. And I'll talk more about that as we kind of progress. So let's talk about pretrial in relationship to probation and parole. First, pretrial release, it's a constitutional and statutory right for almost every defendant who's arrested, with rare exception. There is a small set of crimes in Colorado, particularly just Class 1 felonies, and it really boils down to first-degree murder, in which the court has the ability to detain that person without bond or without release. Everybody else has a constitutional right to release with conditions or not. It's important to remember that individuals on pretrial release have not been convicted, and not all cases will end in a conviction either. The court has statutory limitations on the conditions of release. Pretrial is administered at a local level. Not every county in the state has pretrial services. Roughly about 25% do. Most of the populated Front Range counties in the Western Slope do, but many rural and frontier counties don't even have pretrial services. Shifting to probation, right? This is the phase of the criminal justice system. There's a conviction. The court's looking at a sentence, the court's looking at a sentencing alternative, and a privilege of probation. The court has much wider discretion to set conditions, and there's more teeth in the sentence, if you will. It's administered both at a local and state level by the judicial branch. And then we reach the far end of the system. That's post-prison. So for adult felons who are eventually sentenced to the prison system, when they discharge that sentence, they serve a period of parole. And there are conditions of release set there. So the biggest takeaway is pretrial happens really early in the case. There's a presumption of innocence. There's limitations on who can be held. There's limitations on what conditions can be applied by the court. Very different than probation and parole, which are sentences. So now I'm going to shift into the definition of pretrial as an agency. So pretrial is an agency under the Community Corrections Division, and we really exist to have 2 functions to assist the court. Shortly after arrest, our staff will meet with the defendant, with someone who's recently been arrested. We'll do an interview, we'll compile a criminal history report, we'll do a pretrial risk assessment, and make recommendations on a bond report that goes before the judge. We're also available to do, for anybody who has conditions of release, we have a case management team that monitors people in the community. So what does that work look like? Excuse me one second. This chart shows the work. So you can see the blue chart represents the number of bond reports or pretrial risk assessments completed annually, and that ranges from 10 to 12,000. The average daily population, the chart on the right, represents the number of individuals that report to our case management teams on any given day. So you can see that we hover well above the 2,000 individuals on pretrial release. We hit an extremely high number at the height of the pandemic, reaching almost 2,800. That has begun to reset back to traditional levels. I mentioned before the framework, and we call it a legal principle and framework for how pretrial decisions are made. So I'll sort of repeat some of the constitutional requirements, right? With limited exception, pretrial defendants have a fundamental and constitutional right to bail, regardless of financial status. And I'll underscore that point a little bit later. Bail is not intended to punish. When someone's arrested and bond is being considered and conditions of release, it's not meant to punish. It's meant to ensure people come back to court and hopefully reduce any new arrest or new charge. Bail can be excessive. And that's an important consideration that the judges have to kind of follow as they're making their decision. Again, these limitations are defined in our Colorado Constitution in Section 19, Article 2. We also have the statutory framework, right? Title 16 talks about who can be detained pretrial. Again, a very small set of offenses that can be detained pretrial. In 2013, our entire section of the statute was repealed and reenacted to encourage, first of all, to limit the use of financial release, to also encourage the use of research-informed tools like pretrial assessments, and I'm going to talk more about that significant legislation when we talk about bail reform. There's also a presumption of release and a mention of least restrictive conditions. So these are all things the court has to consider when the defendant is before them at their first hearing. We'll also talk a little bit further in more detail about several pieces of legislation over the years that have sort of built upon that 2013 framework. So what does it look like? This is a chart that kind of will walk us through the first 48 hours after someone's arrested. So someone is arrested and booked into the jail. Within 12 to 24 hours, pretrial services meets with that individual. It's important to note I listed the categories of offenses that pretrial interacts with. So we work with anybody who's been arrested for a felony, anybody that's been arrested for a misdemeanor that qualifies under the Victim Rights Act. And off to the left side of that column, I provide a reference to the statutory section that talks about the Victim Rights Act and some examples of some crimes. We also work with folks who have been charged with the DUI and have a prior, and all levels of domestic violence, meaning both municipal level and state level charges. It's important to note that that happens within the first 24 hours of the arrest. Within 48 hours of the arrest, there's now a statutory requirement that the court has to set bond. And when they set bond, let's talk about bond types. And for simplicity, I want to break it down into two types: a personal recognizance bond or a PR bond. What that means is that individual does not have to put any money up front in order to be released from custody. The other bond type is a monetary or cash bond. It can be served both as just pure cash, $500 cash in order to get out, or a percentage that's paid to a professional surety or bondsman. So on a $5,000 bond, $500 is paid to that surety. It's non-refundable to that defendant. So the court has to decide which bond type, a PR bond or some type of financial bond. They also may order conditions of release. If they order conditions of release, that's where the pretrial case management teams will meet with that person. It could be electronic monitoring, drug testing, case management, things like that. After bond has been set and satisfied, meaning if it's a financial bond, that person posts it, or if it's a PR bond, it's signed, the defendant has to be released within 6 hours. If they're released regardless of time of day, pretrial exists 24/7. We have an office in the jail. As soon as someone is processed out of custody, they meet with our team, we go through an intake, and we set them up for monitoring services. So again, I think this really just illustrates how fast this all happens and the requirements that the court has on it. So I talked about bail reform and why we made some changes. And I want to just sort of level set here and talk about the problem and why many cities, many counties, and many states have taken on the issue of bail reform. So every year, millions of people are booked into the jails, most of them for nonviolent misdemeanors. And this is a national statistic. Over 60% of jail inmates are unconvicted, and they remain in jail strictly because of financial barriers to post even small amounts of monetary bonds. There's been work done by the Arnold Foundation, both in 2013 and in 2022, that talks about the hidden costs of pretrial detention. Even small amounts of jail time, particularly for lower risk individuals, have tremendous downstream consequences. They destabilize the individual. They result oftentimes in harsher penalties or sanctions and higher rates of convictions. The other side of the broken system related to financial bail or money bail is some of the highest risk defendants, people that are high risk to FTA or high risk to be rearrested, but have financial means to get out, post-bond and released. That's why Denver took on the challenge of bail reform. So even though the work started before 2011, a lot of us like to point to the call for action back then by Attorney General Holder, who demanded pretrial justice reform. Denver took its first large step in 2012 when we implemented Colorado's first ever developed pretrial risk assessment tool. That tool had been developed in consultation and collaboration with several counties in the state, and it helped identify the risk to FTA and the risk to be rearrested for a new crime. We also developed a matrix which guides staff's decision-making and recommendations to the court for supervision. I talked about the statutory reform in 2013. Just know that that statutory reform was the culmination of work of the State Commission on Criminal Juvenile Justice and the work of the CCJJ Bail Subcommittee that had been meeting for, I think, 18 months or 2 years before that. In 2013, we implemented a secondary risk assessment to be used only on our domestic violence cases. And this tool helps us to predict the likelihood of new intimate partner violence on the same victim for individuals charged with the DV offense. In 2014, Denver received a Department of Justice grant, which I'll talk a little bit more about in upcoming slides. But 3 sites in the country were selected. Denver was one of them. 2017, 2019, and 2021 all see other additional bond reform legislation to decrease reliance on financial conditions of release, especially for low-level offenses, and the expedited release of individuals pre-trial. So I talked about smart pre-trial. The highlights here, one of 3 sites in the country selected. Denver formed a policy team comprised of representation of all criminal justice stakeholders. We were provided with technical assistance from the federal government. They mapped our process. We looked at current processes, and we helped to construct a new process in which bond and bail conditions could be set. Here was the membership. So you can see that all agencies within the criminal justice system are represented. We had the courts, we had prosecution, we had defense, we had law enforcement, including DPD, we had the Crime Prevention and Control Commission, the Department of Safety, and of course, pretrial services. Eventually, that group outlined a vision and guiding principles for how bond is administered in Denver, the 2nd Judicial District, and that led to both the chief judge of the district court and presiding court, judge of the county court, to issue a judicial order outlining how pretrial functions and how bond is set in the county. So we mentioned PR bonds. Again, a PR bond means that someone does not have to put up any cash or percentage of cash up front in order to be released. You can see since the bail reform effort took place back in 2011, we've seen increases in the rate of PR bonds. The slide also illustrates if there's any disparate impact to defendants of color as they go through the system. One of the criticisms of the original version of the CPAT, the pretrial risk assessment tool, was that there were defendants of color found themselves falling into higher risk categories, and that sometimes led to lower rates of PR. The next slide is going to talk about what we're doing to address that. I will say that the gap is closing. If you look at in 2020, those numbers are kind of almost becoming a single line, which would be the desired state. So how do we address that? It's the implementation of the Colorado Pretrial Assessment Tool revised. This was work undertaken by an academic institution, the University of Northern Colorado, who worked with several counties under state funding, and the project had 3 phases. First was to actually validate the original version of the CPAT, which was validated, so it does predict. The second phase was to hold focus groups across the state with stakeholders to determine what could be improved. The phase 3 was the construction of a new tool, a tool that could be more predictive in looking at FTA risk as well as new arrest risk, and as importantly, decreasing any statistical bias that might exist in the tool. So certain variables that are risk factors were either reweighted or removed in order to reduce that bias. The next steps for us are hopefully to implement it. We just met with the mayor and his staff this week. You might recall that the mayor had asked as part of his public safety plan to look at the pretrial risk assessment process. And so that work sort of dovetailed onto previous work. The court had formed a working group to look at implementation of CPAT-R. So the mayor listened to what that working group recommended, and I'm pleased to report that he is supportive of moving us in this direction, because the tool, the CPAT-R, is an improved tool because it has greater ability to predict pretrial performance or misconduct, and it'll bring equity across the subgroups. So let's talk some data. We know that crime and rising crime is a concern for the community. We look at the last 4 years of data of our pretrial supervised population. And what we see is that the vast majority of defendants released pretrial do not reoffend. So almost 90%. So what we're seeing is a failure rate for a new arrest or charge at around 11 to 14%, depending upon the year. We break that down a little further, and we separate the type of new arrest or charge by seriousness. And how we do that is we say, if it was a crime that's covered under the Victim Rights Act, we consider that to be a more serious crime. Those that are not are less serious. You can see that with the exception of 2020, less than 4% of the time, a defendant who's released pretrial is rearrested for a Victim Rights Act case. In 2020, it did increase slightly to just a little over 5.5%. So let's look at BRA crimes by bond type. Again, bond type defining a PR bond is no money up front. Monetary bond is either being cash, surety, or bondsman. You can see that in each of the past 4 years, the rate of individuals who post a PR bond, who are granted a PR bond, and then charged with the VRA crime remains lower than those on financial bail. Now, that's not to suggest that bond type matters. It's to illustrate the opposite, that unfortunately, people will fail on both PR bonds and surety bonds, but they don't fail at higher rates on PR bonds. Let's talk about the other significant measure for pretrial, and that's court appearance. You see a slightly different story being told here. We see that if you look back to 2018 and 19, we see that individuals released on financial conditions of release had slightly higher rates of court appearance. In 2020, that flattened, and in 2021, it inversed. I can't explain the inverse. We'll have to continue to watch that. There's a lot of conversation that even for appearance rates, while it might seem intuitive that having money attached to the release makes a difference, there's evidence out there that it doesn't, so we'll have to continue to track this. What is predictive is risk assessment. So going back to, I know there's a lot on this slide, so I'll try to walk you through it. So this slide is showing the rate of a new arrest and a new charge over the last 4 years. Each column represents 4 years. And the risk continuum moves left to right. So category folks are lower risk, category 2 a little bit higher, all the way up to category 4, which is our highest risk pretrial defendant. And again, when I say risk, that's not an indication of dangerousness, it's just risk to fail, either by FCA or risk to fail by any new arrest. So risk matters. You can see that lowest risk populations succeed pretrial at well over 95% success rates. Even our highest risk population, though, falls just under 90%, right? They're in that 85 to 90. So that brings one of the challenges before the court. Why don't we just try to do what we can within the limited provisions of our statute and constitution to keep those folks in custody? Well, still there's a significant number, the majority don't reoffend. Same thing can be said for appearance rates, right? Same flow to the chart, lowest risk to the left, moves up to the right. But our highest risk population, the category 4, there's still roughly half of those individuals will come to court. So this is why it's so important to never limit judicial discretion and professional judgment in a process. We never advocate that the pretrial risk assessment tool should ever take the place or replace judicial decision-making. Remember, the court's looking at the tool as one factor. They're looking at the probable cause statement or the arrest information from the police department. They're looking at the criminal history. They're looking at stability factors. So all this comes together in the court's setting of the type of bond and conditions release. Oh, and by the way, they have those legal framework parameters still kind of governing the conditions of release and type of bond. I wanted to mention this because we are wanting and need to improve our outcomes, right? That's our goal. We come to work every day wanting to see better outcomes, wanting to see less crime. We know that a majority of our failure is driven by behavioral health issues. We know that those suffering from addiction, those with severe mental illness who can't access treatment are driving our failure rates. One of the things we've done to address that is we approached 2 community partners, the Second Chance Center and Tribe Recovery Homes, last year. And we talked to them about our needs, and they ended up applying for a Caring for Denver Foundation grant and received it. And it's a 3-year grant that allows them to embed peer navigators into our pretrial process. So we have navigators, individuals with lived experience, both at our release functions 24/7 and through the duration of the pretrial period to assist folks getting to court, getting them connected to services. The other thing we've worked through a state human services grant is competency-based restoration pilot. So individuals who are incompetent to proceed with trial, because of the backlog of beds in the state hospital and in custody, there are some folks that it's appropriate risk to have them in the community and go through community restoration. So we receive funding from the state for 1 pretrial officer, as well as the Mental Health Center of Denver receives money for services. We also are focused on improving our internal case management and helping folks sort of have positive outcomes, and that's through the implementation and reaching fidelity to what we call core correction practices. And that's just a set of skills to help enhance positive outcomes for folks. And I highlighted the next section. It's a hard lift. It's not anything that we can do. It's not anything this council can do by itself. But Colorado, in my opinion, has left a gap in bail reform. It's addressed the release of individuals under non-financial conditions. It's addressed timely release. It's addressed least restrictive conditions. It hasn't strengthened the ability on the other end of the continuum. There are individuals that should be detained pre-trial, either because they pose such a danger to the community or they continue to fail to appear for court. Again, current legal structure limits who can be detained pre-trial. There would need to be a constitutional amendment to get there, but as long as people ask, I'm going to advocate for this. This is as some would call it, the other half of the loaf that needs to be fixed to really complete bail reform. If you look at states that have done it right, the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., has a bail, no bail dichotomy. Same thing with the federal system. The state of New Jersey, the state of New Mexico, Illinois just went there. And it really then says the person before you either gets released with no financial conditions because they're an appropriate risk, or they're such a risk they're detained. It takes that financial ability to sort of have high-risk people get out of jail because of financial means, and people with barriers to financial access or lower financial access stay in jail. So that's me preaching and asking, but I really see that as the long-term solution. I'm happy to take questions. I tried to run through that heavy slide deck as fast as I could, Mr. Chair.
You did great. Thank you very much for the presentation, Greg. We do have some folks in the queue. Councilmember Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Greg, slide 15, I want to make sure I understand, is saying essentially that over the last 4 years, somewhere between 11% and 14% of pretrial defendants are rearrested on either Victim Rights Act offenses or non. Could you, and it seems to be consistent over those years, slight variations in the totals from year to year. Can you just list for us some of the crimes that are non-Victim Rights Act crimes? The VRA crimes tend to be the ones that are violent. Is that so? Does this mirror like the FBI stats for violent crime and property crime?
Thanks for the question, Councilman Flynn. Not exactly. It might be easier to talk more in response the opposite way, what constitutes a victim rights crime, because everything else would be a non-VRA crime. Sure. So every arrestable offense is considered a new charge or a possible new arrest for pretrial. When we're talking about victim rights crimes, right, we're talking about assaults, we're talking about sexual assaults, robberies, menacing, all levels of domestic violence, things like that. So non-VRA crimes would be everything else. I don't know if that's helpful. I would certainly be happy to provide the exhaustive list to this body of VRA crimes to help understand.
Sure. I'd like to see that, because I know that a lot of the concerns that have been expressed over the last year or so with the rising crime rate in Denver tend to be property crimes, but nevertheless are very impactful on working families, auto theft in particular. I found out yesterday of a friend of mine whose car was stolen and has a severe impact on their ability to work for their job, et cetera. And so I would like to understand the difference, and I like that you're tracking the two of them, even if separately, but I do like that we're also tracking non-VRA repeat offenses. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Council Pro Tem Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much, Greg. Really appreciate the breakdown in data. I just want to make sure a couple things that I'm understanding. Slide 15, what I'm reading from that, you said the vast majority of defendants released pretrial do not reoffend. That even increased from 2020 to 2021, just under 90%. Slide 16, the rate of individuals who have a PR bond and get a new arrest, a victim rights arrest, is lower now than cash bond releases. And then slide 17, individuals released on cash bond, slightly higher rates of court appearance, but in 2021, those with PR bond actually surpassed those folks at 67% coming to court appearance. So a couple of the things that we've seen echoed in media, one in particular was that one of our news outlets said that 45% of those who receive a PR bond fail to show up for a future court appearance. Did that data point ever come up in in your system? Like, where did that number come from?
Thank you, Councilwoman Torres. I don't know the data set, but it is not our data. And so let me just clarify that this data set, it's the pretrial supervised population. So there are some offenses and defendants that don't go through a pretrial interview process, don't go through supervision. The majority of those are low-level municipal level offenses, or even on some of the higher case types, the court determines there's not a need for pretrial supervision. So we wouldn't have the outcomes on those two groups, just to clarify. Also, when we talk about new crime, we're saying new crime during the pretrial period. So it's not predicting out 2 or 3 years, it's just during the pretrial period. I would say that we do see higher rates of FTA, especially for our individuals who assess at higher risk. But I do not have any idea where the 45% came from that media story.
Okay, got it. Thank you. One of the other things that I think has been repeated is that the district attorney's office has something to do in changing this practice or the policy. What is or is not their role when it comes to how a PR bond or any bond is delivered or deliberated?
So on offenses that fall under the state's jurisdiction, so the jurisdiction of the district attorney, which are misdemeanors and felons, within that 24 hours of arrest, there's a first advisement hearing. And historically, let me share this with you, before that SMART pretrial grant, the prosecution was absent during that process. So bond was being set just with the assistance of pretrial, a defense attorney sometimes in the court. Post-SMART pretrial, the district attorney's office started attending that hearing. So there is the opportunity for the DA to argue for a certain type of bond. If there's financial considerations being mentioned, they can argue for higher amounts, and they can certainly provide input to the types of release conditions. Their ability to detain is limited, just as the courts is, through the Constitution and statute.
And to that point, you said earlier that judges cannot detain based on risk. And is that based on constitutional constraints or something else?
Well, they shouldn't detain, even in those states that have a detention model, they shouldn't detain solely on risk. There should be a number of factors. But Colorado's limitations are around its constitution and statute that narrowly define a certain subset of crimes that are eligible for a process to be detained. And again, practically speaking, that's murder. There's a couple of other things that rarely are seen, but it's really those that are charged with first-degree murder are eligible for detention.
Okay. Based on what you've presented, I wouldn't look at this data and go, this system is in error. There's something wrong categorically with our bonding system. So what does the CPAT-R bring into the conversation that wasn't already there?
So what the improved tool will do is it will continue to help us identify the lower risk population so that the judges can focus their efforts on those that pose a higher risk to fail, FTA or any rearrest, and then we can mitigate that through the appropriate monitoring and supervision techniques. And the ability to sort of close the gap in terms of any negative disparate impacts across race, ethnicity, and what we call residential status, which is for the unhoused population.
Okay, so that makes sense to me, right? To better identify who doesn't need to get, I think, either a cash bond or get caught up into more than whatever they're there for, kind of obligates the system to provide. Mm-hmm. Is there, like you detailed, I think, a pretty extensive history of reform that's been taking place. Has it been your sense that any of that has led to kind of this current climate that we talk about of high crime, of increased crime, that this particular system is at fault?
I think it's difficult to assign fault to any one factor or one piece of legislation. I will say we continue to make great strides around solving for not having people in jail because they can't afford to get out. Mm-hmm. We're missing the other side of the equation. So I apologize if that's irritating to keep repeating that, but I want people to hear that. We have to demand that we get to the ability to detain the right people, not everyone, but a narrow slice. We also know that there are, with individuals who are released quickly, or perhaps more quickly into a community-based setting, if they're struggling with behavioral health crisis, that we need to support them. So I wouldn't say any piece of legislation is a cause. I would just ask that there's more work to be done to make sure there's adequate services in place when those folks are released.
That makes sense. Thank you. And when we talk about a constitutional right to be released, or that judges can't detain just based on risk, is that a state constitutional change or a federal one?
And I'm operating a little bit out of my wheelhouse. I'm not an attorney, council member, but there's obviously U.S. constitutional considerations around what bail is and isn't. The state constitution, Article 2 of our state constitution, again, identifies which crimes are detention eligible through it's a process called proof evident presumption great. It's an extra hearing that has to occur in order to detain an individual. The challenge there is the list of crimes that are eligible is really narrow.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Pro Tem. Councilmember Sandoval.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg. This is illuminating information, because I think there's this sentiment out in the public that if you're out on bond and if you're out on a PR bond, that you're more likely to commit another crime, which your data is not proving. So thank you for sharing that information. And also on slide 9, it says 60% of jail inmates are unconvicted. So I think that's a stat that we need to talk about. Just because you are arrested and let out doesn't mean that you are guilty. You are not guilty until you're found guilty in the United States. So I think that's another important distinction. One thing when we're using words like personal recognizant bond, can you say that in just a different term, not use city or state acronyms? Can you just say, so if I go to jail, let's just say Councilman Sandoval goes to jail, someone has to come out and I have a $5,000, I have $500, I understand that. That's a monetary. Talk to me about the personal recognizant bond. What happens if you don't go to jail and you're out on a personal recognizant bond? Because I think everyone can put in their mind, if you don't show up to court when you're supposed to, when you're out on a money bond, the money gets taken away. You don't get the money back. But if you follow through with everything, you can get the money back, or the deed to your house, or whatever that may be. What happens on a personal recognizant bond?
Councilwoman Sandoval, I'm going to take a high-level attempt to, one, better define a PR bond and answer your question. And if you want additional detail, I brought the A-team with me today. I brought my pretrial manager, Aubrey Cote, who can really get into the details of bond forfeiture if you'd like. But first, a PR bond, a personal recognizance bond, essentially says if Craig was arrested and the judge issues a PR bond, that I just have to sign. It says, I promise to appear at my next court hearing and abide by these conditions. It doesn't require any monetary amount up front, like the $500 or $5,000. There is almost always a dollar amount attached to a PR bond. For example, it's a $5,000 PR bond. So that's there in the event forfeiture action is taken by FTA. It just doesn't require the defendant to post any portion of that $5,000 in order to be released from custody. So if you think about a PR bond, it's just the defendant saying, I acknowledge my responsibilities to appear in court and follow these guidelines. And there's a dollar amount attached to it, but it's not required of me to pay it out. And for clarification, even though there's always a dollar amount attached to a PR bond, none of that is, when we talk about separating bond type, PR versus money, those dollar amounts on PR bonds are not in the data set for money bail. They're just a PR bond.
Okay, thank you. That helps distinguish some of the confusion that I had with the PR bond. that there is still a monetary money amount to it. I don't think I realized that. And if you could just, to Councilman Flynn's point, if you could just send out these categories. I think a lot of time when we are all such specialties in our wheelhouse, like I love zoning, I could talk about bulk planes and I could talk about side interior setbacks. You all have these specialties and we use acronyms. It's hard for the public to understand. So if you can send out the non-victim rights arrests or the new victim rights arrests, that would be really helpful for me so I could better understand what those terminologies are when I'm looking back at the slide deck.
Absolutely, and Councilwoman, if I may perhaps build on my earlier response too, I think oftentimes there's confusion about when people are released in the community, that there's a perception of some that only those on PR bonds get out. It's not true, right? A large percentage of folks on financial bonds are out too. Again, sometimes folks with financial means get out very quickly, some that do not stay in a little longer, but a lot of folks are on financial bonds too. So that's why this conversation about a PR bond or a money bond being a driver to crime doesn't make sense and is not supported by the data. That's a bond type. Both have failure and both will get out. What we're trying to do is make it a more equitable system by not allowing individuals with financial means to get out and those that do not to stay in. That's what's broken, which is why there's bail reform.
And one last question. You mentioned other states that have worked to rid the system of PR or money bond, just to keep the offenders who should be there, the smaller slice of the pie, like you said, in jail and not get out on pre-trial, and the other ones released knowing that they would get back. Is there any movement in the, because I believe that would probably have to be a state. Is there any movement? Has there been discussion? Has your office been monitoring that?
There's definitely been conversations, and that I've personally been a part of 2 subcommittees or task force under the CCJJ, the original one back in 2012, and then more recently in 2018, to look at that as a model. It's called preventive detention. That's another term that's used. Both times it just couldn't get across the recommendation. It couldn't receive enough consensus from all the various stakeholders. And it really comes down to, I think, the challenge around which crimes are detention eligible, right? How wide of a list should the number of crimes be that you can actually detain someone and take away their liberty during the pretrial period of their case, and how much process is involved, right? If the list of eligible crimes is longer, a lot of folks want a lot of process involved. So that's where sort of the stalemate happened and why we couldn't get there, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And last but not least, Council President Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank you, Greg, for the presentation, and I would like you to follow up and send us over any information, especially statistics, how the bail or non-bail, or the bail or no bail model of pretrial justice, how that affects allowing more Black and Latinx individuals having no bail. I'm comparing slide 13, where the PR bonds, we still have a majority of white folks getting out on PR bonds, followed closely by Latinx, and then Black individuals, it's sort of stagnant and leveled off. And so I'd be interested in getting some statistics and resources around that bail or no bail model that you spoke of.
Yeah, I believe we can look at information from both Washington, D.C. and the state of New Jersey that might have some of that information. It would be great resources.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Well, seeing no further folks in the queue, Greg, thank you very much for the presentation. Thanks for the work you do, and yeah, the clarification on the misconceptions, I think, that are out there on the effect of PR bonds versus money bonds, et cetera, just don't seem to hold up under the data. So appreciate you bringing that forward. And seeing no further work for this body this afternoon, This meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.